Jim Schaefer, the producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Julie Ellison, who's here to discuss her book, Cato's Tears and the Making of Anglo-American Emotion. Julie, this is one of those books that really needs us to provide its context for the viewers before we can discuss it. Perhaps you can explain the title of your book, which will also assist the viewers in comprehending with some accuracy the important concepts in it, including the notions of sensibility and fancy, as well as the period of time within which you examine drama, poetry, fiction that developed on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, of course, the question is the title is meant to be a teaser and raises several questions. Who is Cato? Why is he crying? And is there such a thing as Anglo-emotion anyway? So to start with the first one, who is Cato? Cato is this icon of the Roman Republic, and everyone who's ever thought about the Roman Republic since the Romans periodically zeroes in on the figure of the Stoic Cato, who was trying to resist Caesar's imperial aspirations and is often an outpost in North Africa, realizes he's going to lose, sees the body of one of his sons brought before him, does not weep, is so committed to the idea of Rome, the cause of liberty, the principle of law, that mere personal familial tragedy is something that he can contemplate without weeping. He does, before he commits suicide, shed one tear, or maybe two, for Rome herself. And so the idea of the Stoic who gives a glimmer of emotion, but who managed to represent the Republican cause and the cause of liberty and the defiance of the tyrant. What really happens in this very important play called Cato in 1713, which I take as my real conceptual starting point, what really happens in that play is that Cato may be Stoic, but nobody else is, so that you have Cato inspiring copious tears in some women, but mostly in men. I mean, women weep 2 or 3 times in the play over men, typically. Men weep at one time or another 7 times, and these emotional, sensitive, tender-hearted guys surrounding the Stoic and really weeping over the spectacle of his self-control gives us a sense of the relationship between the citizen who somehow stands for unemotional law, and how emotional we all get over that citizen, so that we may think of the Roman Republican as one guy. He's never just one guy. It's always this drama, this set of relationships among men, which are very emotionally fraught. And although we never use the word sentimental for anything before, 1725, maybe as a rule, I try to push this back much earlier and say that's been there much longer period of time. Now, the business about Anglo-American emotion really begins to suggest some of the context you were asking about, really what's the historical domain of this book. And I'm really looking at late 17th, 18th, early 19th century Anglo-American political culture and the way political culture becomes literary culture. The way that literature is a way to think about our national identities and our group identities of all kinds, whether it's a gender identity or belonging to a particular ethnic group or a colony. And I think that Anglo-American emotion, who knows if there is such a thing as Anglo-American emotion. I would probably argue that there wasn't a singular entity of that kind, but that there is an Atlantic culture, more than just early American or British, but there is truly a very complicated globalization going on. And I think this is why these issues are so relevant for us now, that this is happening at a time when mercantile empires, religious missionary activity, conquest of a military kind, and the sense among Britons of every ilk that they are part of something bigger than the nation, but at which the nation is very much at stake. all of this is swirling around and is always emotional. Anything that has to do with identity is always emotional, and I think that's really the premise, that there is such a thing you can refer to in shorthand as Anglo-American emotion.
Oh, one of the interesting things about your book is it's so extensively done on both sides of the Atlantic, and you point out a lot of examples about that.
Well, I've had this career where just by accident, and I've now ended up being someone who works on Anglo-American literary culture, and it has to do with the fact that, you know, you get interested in one thing and another, and over a period of time you work on the English side and you work on the North American side, and then now we are at this moment where people are very interested in the system, in the Atlantic Rim culture.
Well, it was from this basis of the literature that you're looking at that you're able to date it earlier than what had existed before.
Well, yes, it is through the literature, but I really zero in at my earliest point in what's called the exclusion crisis, a political crisis in England in 1680, at the very end of the 1670s, going over into 1681. And I look at plays. I really look at these dramas, and the important thing to remember about plays in that period is that they weren't. If you say literature, you tend to think that of people sitting at home and reading a book. These were more like the political primary debates in New Hampshire that were televised. Obviously, these were not. They didn't part of mass culture, but within the 200 or 300 men who formed the kind of political culture in London and in cities that honed in on London as their center. These plays were very politically charged. People would go to the plays, they would go in political factions, they would cheer or boo, depending on their political affiliation. Everybody knew that any play having to do with the Roman Republic was absolutely about a particular political group in Parliament and not the other political group, so that the politics could be playing out at court, they could be playing out in Parliament, they could be playing out in the theater, but it was very much a politically charged genre.
It was kind of encoded, how everybody could read into, as you were saying, who that person was. And
Well, in 1713, when Cato was the most important political play of the 18th century. This is Addison's Cato. This is a little bit later. I mean, I talk about this crisis in 1780, and I talk about this play that really is a kind of culmination of things that started in 1680 that comes out in 1713. When the figure of Cato was performed in that play, you had both the Whigs and the Tories claiming Cato as one of theirs. The Tories would say, "Oh, Cato really represents our way of thinking," and the Whigs would say, "Oh no, he doesn't. This is a Whig hero." And so the contest for who owned certain principles was pretty direct.
Before we go much further, I wanted to comment that I found it fascinating that the public expression of feeling that you explore in the political culture in England and the United States in this period, the 17th to the early 19th century, continues to exist in a number of ways even today. And as you point out, examples include the empathetic representations of suffering, like the broadcast of the videotape beating of Rodney King, and then the intimate connections among sentimentality, gender, and politics evoked in the crisis of the impeachment of President Clinton just last fall in 1998.
Yes, I think this is very much a book of the 1990s. For me, I think of everything I do in the way of literary history as being motivated by the question of what do we need to know now about our past. And so, given the fact that sensitive males were such a cultural and political issue in the 1990s, I felt I needed to understand where this was coming from. One of the other things about where this book came from is that in 18th century studies, generally during the 1990s, I grew up in that moment when we all thought of the 18th century as the Enlightenment, which we thought of as the age of reason, and that somehow this was all about rationality. And since I've never been really convinced that rationality was ever very rational, I always had a certain detachment from the 18th century. But once I started to realize that the age of reason was also the age of sentiment, then the whole thing became much more more interesting to me. But I think that one of the very interesting things about the 1990s, and I think this is ongoing, is that certain kinds of emotional characteristics became mapped onto certain kinds of government policies and agendas, so that the idea of liberalism became mapped onto this idea of the welfare state, or of spending to take care of people, spending to take care of people's suffering. And the opposition to the welfare state, the opposition to that notion of a liberalism that sees the role of government as being the role of care. The opposition to that tends to celebrate a certain kind of toughness, a certain kind of tough love, a perspective that is, we have the market and we have the individual, and really the government should take less of a role and should be sterner and more masculine in the sense of masculine toughness, tough-mindedness. And so not only do you have these questions of Bill Clinton as a sensitive, empathetic president, as an empathetic kind of deep-feeling man, and people's comfort or discomfort with that persona, but you also have these questions of liberalism itself having a kind of personality, and conservatism having a certain kind of manly personality to it, so that these debates about who's the stoic and who's the sensitive guy get played out in the policy arena.
Is this a function of empire, that you profess to be concerned about those that are disadvantaged or exploited on behalf of the empire, but don't really alleviate the suffering?
Well, the question of what what one does with this knowledge is, there's no one answer to that. I mean, there are people who take that knowledge and become very effective. I mean, do not just sit around and feel, but in fact, this feeling for them motivates action of various kinds, either cultural action in terms of journalistic kinds of action, parliamentary action, protest, and missionary action in some cases. Whatever one thinks of those missionary actions, they are actions. And I think that there's just a million answers to what you do with that emotion. It doesn't necessarily mean just because you have that emotion doesn't, and try to get enough examples so that I can that you're acquiescing to an oppressive system, and there's a million different responses at different times, extremely variable. One of the things I argue in this book is that in that very early moment, starting around parliamentary politics, people were trying to invent parliamentary politics. There almost were no parliamentary politics in the late 17th century. People were trying to figure out, is it okay to have these things that have ultimately become political parties? When you look at how sensitive manhood, weeping guys, play out in the poems and the plays and the philosophizing that's going on in what becomes early Whig politics. It's all about emotion, really, between elite men. It's really among leaders, perhaps fathers and sons. There may be some generational differences, but it's really among men who are peers. Then these nuances of who's a stoic and who's sensitive. Men are moved by others like themselves, and they appreciate the noble-mindedness of someone who's their social equal. And there's this effort to say, no, we're not really just conspirators here. We really are acting for the good of the nation. And so when we get together and oppose the king, we are doing it in a high-minded and ethical as an ethical band of brothers, in a way. So there's this legitimizing agenda. People need to legitimize political parties, oppositional, kind of anti-monarchical political parties. Once that's happened, and it happens pretty much by 1713, by the time the Hanoverians are coming in and the Stuarts are out in the English monarchy, then I think being sensitive, having all this sensibility is up for grabs. Culturally, socially, I think anybody can have it. And then there's always been this sense that emotion was very much at work in how you thought about other people in the globe, how you thought about Moors in North Africa, or how you thought about Rome back there in the past. It always had this long distance sense of how emotion is working far away. But more and more after, it's okay to be a Whig, essentially, then all this sensitivity really can work in a number of different ways, and it tends to start working for the middle classes, not just the upper classes. It tends to start working for, Quakers and abolitionists, and also for Tories. That is, pathos can then be ideologically flexible, and you can display someone as a victim, or you can sort of display your own sensitivity in the interests of a number of causes. I think, though, that at that point, emotion of this kind gets more and more to be about pity, about benevolence, about doing good. And this, of course, we can see is working out across empire, but also at home with the poor in London, for example. But then it tends to be not so much about social equals, but about social unequals. So I think there's a real shift about the time we start thinking about the age of sensibility, which is much later, than these earlier moments of sensibility, around the later 18th century. Then it's very much about social inequality and how people in privileged situations cope with their feelings about people that are perceived as being at great social distances from them, either racially or economically or globally. And then it tends to be much more about things that we're familiar with now, when we tend to think about all of our ambivalence about charity, or about pity, or about welfare, about doing things on behalf of others, as though those are always motivated by a sense of sort of personal feeling.
Did this parallel the shift from monarchy to, you're talking about the parliament, and that this started spreading out?
Yeah, I think so very much. I think those forms of the state, I say in the book, in the acknowledgments, that my colleague Ann Stoller asked this question at one point when I had presented part of this book, but Julie, what about the state? And I was like, oh my God. I've talked about empire, I've talked about nationalities, I've talked about race, but I forgot to talk about the state. But I do think that it is, first of all, that this does in some ways take the form of a story about how people are moving away from monarchical forms, and what kinds of political groupings people have, what forms of identifications. The third Earl of Shaftesbury, in his book called Characteristics, which is really a kind of anthology of writings of different kinds, but it comes out in 1711, and he has this wonderful writings about conspiracy and faction, about how really human beings are so naturally sociable, and so naturally form themselves into groups bound by identification and affection, that political conspiracy is really just another form of human bonding. And yes, we can go to war and sort of form a kind of national group against those people out there. But if we're not at war, then or if we get very large and we need smaller groupings, well, then we're going to have conspiracies, because it's another form of sort of
evolution.
Yes, a sort of social formation out of our natural desire to clump together.
Well, you're talking about empire. It includes not just government, but then you talked about export, import trade, and education and publishing, and, as you said before, missionary activity. And those are all the role of the state.
Well, they are and they aren't. I mean, I think that people who are interested now, and everyone is, in this question of civil society, are very interested in the non-state forms of nation and of empire. That is the way that things that really don't have to do with government, that don't have to do with legislation, or don't have to do with policy or tariffs or armies, but rather have to do with newspapers, or with missionary activity, or with trade, which is a big one. How ideas of the nation, or of national identification, get played out through things that aren't necessarily directly state controlled. But I think that one of the things that really interests me is the way people are always trying to give the government a personality.
How does this play out in terms of the transnational structures? I mean, at the moment, the World Trade Organization
Yes,
is meeting in
yes.
Seattle
Right.
with many rioters. But there's also the United Nations, there's the Group of Seven for finance, and the World Bank. There's a number of elements. How does that...
Well, actually, I think that I think that the historical framework. I think you have to have some awareness of what we now call globalization, or of some. You have to have some mental category that allows you to sort of think parts of the world as a system. So whether you're thinking nations, or whether you're thinking nations and colonies, or whether you're thinking continents, or tribes and peoples, this idea of having some kind of point from which you can do a kind of global survey, so that you're looking at pieces of the world in relation to one another in a very self-conscious way. And this is where the early forms of comparative religion come in. This is where people are doing what we now think of as anthropology very early on. What do they, how do the Chinese worship? How do the Africans worship? How do the ancient Egyptians worship? There's all this curiosity, so that you can kind of wrestle all this variety into some system of comparison. And I really think the premise there does come from trade. I think if you look at who was there before England in terms of thinking about global trade systems, well, it was the Dutch. It's where Simon Schama has really, gives a new appreciation of the Dutch Republic. And I think that if you go back and look at people's debates about currency in the early 17th century, about and about tariffs, very early on. There is this awareness of relationships that begins to demand that people start to think and feel across national boundaries. One of the things I get very interested in, because I'm so interested in race and in captivity, and in this book, and slavery is, and everybody's emotions about all that, is looking at not just at the enslavement of Africans in the New World, but before that, really coming out of the Crusades, really, and the expulsion of the Moors from Spain, that you have the captivity of Christians in North Africa. I mean, you have an established set of kind of feelings and charities, fundraising devices, and diplomatic endeavors to try to rescue people out of slavery. And it's very racialized. It's very much about the Turks and what's wrong with the Turks and with Turkish despotism compared to English, freedoms. And so that even at the very earliest moments you're looking at some of these transnational, very emotional relationships.
And that's, excuse me, one of the things you argue is that this early historical period, much earlier than what others scholars have claimed, that these certain emotions have been strongly determined by politics of race and gender. And then perhaps we need to separate these. So what is the relationship between this tenderheartedness and race, between tenderheartedness and gender? And then once you bring these together, the triangulating of race, gender, and emotional sensibility, in doing that, what can you discover you couldn't discover before?
Well, let me go back to Addison's Cato again, because this is a play. Fortunately, people I think are starting to read this play again. And
well, this may well put it on the bestseller list.
Well, this play has everything. I mean, in this play, first of all, and you probably you would barely know this if you read the contemporary reviews. That is, when it came out, it was much written about, much talked about, and this went on for 100 years. But people almost always talked about the play Cato as though there was only one guy in it. As though it was a one-man show, and it consisted only of Cato himself. In fact, nothing could be farther from the truth. The romantic lead, there was Cato, the sort of older, heroic Roman male, but the romantic lead is an African prince named Juba, and he was in love with Cato's daughter, Marcia, and in fact gets the girl. I mean, he marries Marcia, and Marcia is in fact a noble Roman herself. She models her own ethics on her father's, and Juba, the the African prince has been taught by his father to admire the Romans, and he models himself on Cato. So you have all these people all modeling themselves on Cato, and but at the same time you have Juba's. There are other Africans, African generals, and Juba's generals, and the people around him say, look, get rid of your illusions about the Roman Empire. They say Rome was founded on a rape. It was founded on a rape. It was saved by women, and ever since Romans have been pretending to be so ethical. Can't you see through this? It's extremely explicit. It's hard to, So this question of this, I'm sort of leaping to the end of the question. So how do sort of race and gender and empire all matter together? I just think that there's something in the figure of the ambivalent African. This is in Addison's Cato now, that you have Juba as the conflicted African, where he's in the kind of son role relative to Cato, who's a kind of second father to him. He's also having to play out in his own mind the sense of, am I a Stoic? If I am Roman, am I a Stoic like Cato, or am I going to be am I going to in fact be defined by my emotions, by my kind of emotional sensitivity to these ethics? How nationalistic am I going to be? That is, am I going to sort of stand for my place and my people, or am I going to stand for some kind of higher idea? Does the idea of law, in fact, apply across? Does it apply to Africans as well as Romans? Can you take that Roman idea and bring it home to Africa? I think what the English intellectuals, what's in it for English political culture is this idea of ambivalence, and this is where I think that if you, that it's this kind of conflict, that the Roman African represents, that makes the racial other so fascinating. I really think that the African, this kind of African figure, comes to signify a kind of emotion. I think it really stops being about race and starts being about a certain kind of emotional position, a certain kind of citizen subjectivity.
All that's contained in your book, Cato's Tears, or evoked by it, I think.
Well, what I try to do is I try to round up enough examples, and I do use poets that we're used to reading and works that we're used to reading. So I look at Dryden's wonderful poem about the exclusion crisis called Absalom and Achitophel, where he takes biblical characters and talks about the king and his illegitimate son Monmouth, who's becoming very popular. And so I try to kind of make the examples count for.
Well, it's a very erudite work. That was quite an interesting
Erudite.
reading. Yes.
All my life, I've wanted to be erudite.
Well, there you are.
I arrived.
Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.